Welcome everyone to the Bodybuilding Dietitians podcast. Thanks for joining us for another episode. You're joined by myself, Lauren, and Talia today. So a trio of bodybuilding dietitians on behind the mic today. So we wanted to talk about the recovery hierarchy today and sort of frame it as a hierarchy because depending on the individual, certain different nuances of recovery will be more important than others. But I think there are certainly aspects in recovery which are glorified and therefore over prioritized. And recovery is often, I think it's especially for our listeners of the podcast, I think recovery is often an underutilized tool where it can be a rate limiter for certain individuals for their progress, like training hard in the gym, but not quite seeing that level of progression or physique change. And there are aspects to it beyond nutrition alone, which we certainly think are worth talking about. And given that we work with clients as well across really every aspect, I think that's what coaching is all about, is tying together nutrition, training, lifestyle, recovery modalities is when the magic happens. So we often have the luxury of being able to look at all those data points for our clients and sort of tie everything together rather than just addressing one single component. So I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about how we're going to sort of frame the hierarchy today. And I will sort of disclaim and caveat and get in here now saying that depending on the individual, some of these will of course move up and down based on what someone is doing and where their sort of recovery levers or sort of roadblocks are coming from. So I talk, speaking of the most important first, I'd probably rate training stress management or just the fatigue generated from training. That is almost always going to be the major contributor of fatigue. And then that encompasses many different factors, which we'll get into, like intensity, volume, etc., other sort of exercise modalities too. Then we have sleep. Then we also have energy availability and protein. I honestly think this is probably the two that probably interlink the most, or quite easily could energy availability be the second most important, but sleep is often an area to be capitalized on as well. And then we have sort of everyday stress and lifestyle. And then we have literally, for the most part, everything else. So sort of niche recovery modalities, supplements, all that good stuff. So, and I think often what we see is people investing a lot in number 5 there, which is the niche recovery stuff, and not enough in the big sort of buckets or the big rocks. So yeah, I'll probably throw this over to you, Lauren, initially, is just talking about that first, any general comments that you have, but then talking a bit about the training itself and how that sets the theme for recovery.
Yeah, recovery has become an enormous industry. We have ice baths, compression boots, massage guns, cryotherapy chambers, infrared saunas, red light devices. But I think one of the biggest problems is that the word recovery is often used without anyone actually defining what that actually means. And I think this is an important distinction before we get into everything. So what does recovery mean? Is it feeling less sore? Is it restoring strength? Is it replenishing muscle glycogen? Is it repairing damaged muscle tissue? Is it reducing fatigue, etc.? And they're not necessarily all the same thing. A recovery strategy may make someone feel less sore without actually meaningfully restoring their strength. It may improve, this is very common, it may improve perceived recovery without actually accelerating muscle repair. It may help an athlete perform again tomorrow, which would be ideal in those contexts as well, potentially reducing some of the long sort of term adaptation they would otherwise, receive from today's training. I think that distinction is really important because much of the recovery industry markets improvements in soreness or comfort as evidence that the body has actually physically recovered faster. And in reality, exercise recovery is a multi-dimensional process involving, the restoration of physical performance, fuel availability, hydration status, neuromuscular function, and physiological readiness following, training or competition. So I think the most appropriate recovery strategy, therefore, really depends on what the athlete has done, what outcome matters most for them, and how quickly that they need to perform again as well. So those considerations matter. I think touching on what you just mentioned, Jack, about the training load. That is definitely very, very important. And I want to really briefly touch on the hierarchies, how I normally see it as well. Like the first priority is definitely managing the training stimulus. I think a lot of people need to look at, are they using appropriate training volume? Are they, progressing load gradually? Are they including enough rest? Are they avoiding training, every session at a maximal effort or tests, because obviously we'll be doing that every single time. I think the second priority is like, are we meeting basic physiological needs? Are we sleeping adequately? Are we consuming enough energy, as you mentioned? Are we meeting daily protein? And then I think the third priority or hierarchy is addressing that lifestyle stress. So work stress, scheduling downtime, using relaxation strategies. And then the fourth one, add a modality for a specific purpose. This is the sprinkle. So it could be cold immersion, maybe in some contexts, could be massage, could be compression garments, or it could be other active recovery modalities. So it really just depends. But yeah, I think with the training load and the programming, like you cannot completely excessive training volume, poor exercise selection, constantly training to failure, too many high intensity sessions. So someone does not have, I think they don't have a recovery problem. Sometimes I think they have a bit of a programming problem. So once we tick that box, I think we then move on to the next consideration.
For sure. Would you add anything into that recovery hierarchy yourself, Talia?
Yeah, so I really agree with what you're saying there, Lauren. And I guess completely agree as well with what you said specifically around kind of the recovery industry profiting so much off, I guess, these really minute things rather than the big pieces that we know really move the puzzle. So of course, supplements is a really big one, ice baths and so on. But at the end of the day, I think I do see a lot of people as well just coming to me and they're training 6 or 7 days a week, just thinking that the more I do, the better, the more it's going to help me to get my dream body. But in reality, it doesn't really matter if you're not recovering from it. And, all of these extra supplements that you have, like a pantry full of vitamin D, vitamin C, everything under the sun, it's not really going to be moving the piece there without having those basic foundations in place. So without prioritizing getting enough sleep, without having a look at your stress, without having a look at your training load too, and just really understanding that more isn't necessarily better. And I'm not sure about you two, but I think a very big part of my job and a lot of the people that I do see has been, I guess, undoing some of those beliefs that I just need to do more and more and more. And that's when we start to also see some results when, we have a look at sleep and maybe modify some things to make that work. When we have a look at training load as well, like if you're, starting with a coach and you have already been plateauing and you're training 6-7 days a week and you're spending so much time in the gym and you're wondering why you're not getting those results, then I think that's where we really need to have a bit of more of a deeper dive into your programming and seeing are you actually recovering from this? And if not, what do we need to do? What's the missing piece or pieces here? Because, as you mentioned as well, Lauren, a lot of the time it's not just one thing. Recovery is so broad. There's so many moving pieces, whether it's your energy availability, whether it's your nutrition, whether it's the training program. It might be a combination of things. So it might need a combination of approaches, but I think that's where having someone to oversee these things is really valuable, because a lot of the time, it's marketed as the supplement, the sauna, the cold plunge, but that's probably not going to be enough.
Yeah, totally agree. Well said. I think, it's, I guess, to continue focusing on training, like it's an interesting one, because I think part of our job is to make people or encourage people to find their limits, but also, or push them to find their limits, but also make sure they're recovering at the same time. And sometimes you need to sort of skirt a little bit too close to the sun to kind of be burned a little bit or singed, I should say, and then sort of find out where your limits are from a recovery standpoint. And I think looking at training, because I do think it's interesting, like, and it's that typical sort of bell curve distribution where like you'll have some people who think they're under recovered, but they've got so much of their potential to still push and see results in the gym or whatever exercise style they're doing. And then you've got people who are on the other side of the curve where they genuinely are doing far too much. And I think the people in that first camp are probably just underutilizing other recovery modalities, or maybe lifestyle stress or other stresses are super high. And it's not as much coming from training load per se. If they're keeping like 5 or 6 reps in reserve and like they're missing days in the gym, then their lack of recovery probably isn't coming from too much training. It's coming from something else, whether it's nutrition or lifestyle. So like, again, focusing on training. So there's often those 3 different sort of buckets that we mentioned, like volume, intensity, execution as well. And like, I often analogize those light switches where like you turn one on and then the other one turns off, or like a bit of a dial analogy. And the same goes here as well. Like if someone's taking every single set to failure, then they're going to be accruing more fatigue. I'm all for high intensity training and like training to failure where it's appropriate, but someone just has to be mindful that if you are taking almost everything to failure, like there definitely is a world in which that can happen, but it typically means volume has to be lower. And again, light switch analogy, where if intensity is higher, then volume probably has to be lower to account for that. And we sort of discussed this in last week's episode as well, but like essentially I'm of the mindset where the more you can do and the more you can recover from, the better your results. So you still want to be pushing your limits, and that's again where recovery is so important, to essentially increase your workload, since we did discuss that relationship between total volume accumulated and your results from a muscle building standpoint. So before I throw this over to you, Lauren, like the other thing that I'd mention for training is that execution factor, because again, like poor execution is almost like a negative multiplier for impaired recovery. If let's say someone's doing a partial rep for a squat and they're doing a half rep instead of a full rep, then they're potentially loading sort of joints and structures which under significantly higher load, when if they just dropped the load and did a full rep and still reached the same intensity, you would be getting a better stimulus, but potentially less sort of localized strain on those particular structures, whether that's, I don't know, hips, knees, etc. So what are your thoughts additionally for training?
Yeah, I think firstly, 2 things. So I have an Olympic lifter who is in now, he's lost about 10 kilos. It's amazing. So we're in diet phase 2. And a part of our weekly check-ins, we gather various biofeedback. So how are you feeling? How's your energy? How's your recovery, etc. He's just like, look, performance is, declining a little bit. I'm a bit gassed, etc. I was like, of course, there is an element of that we can expect when you're in a deficit, of course. We try to mitigate that as much as possible. But I think a very important consideration when your recovery demands are naturally a little bit compromised when you're in a deficit is making sure that your training program or volume or intensity is probably not the same as, when you're at adequate energy availability. So I said, has your coach, he has a separate coach doing his training and programming. I'm doing primarily his nutrition, but I said to him, like, have you had a training review, or has your coach considered the fact that you're now on quite low calories and you're getting even lower body weight? Have you had a bit of a review with him? And he's like, no, I actually haven't. It hasn't changed for months and months. I was like, I'm not saying this is the reason, but just go and have a request a review from him just to see if anything needs to be adjusted. Tell him that you are in this phase, your calories, and this is your body weight. So that's actually a really good idea. I'll go back and do that. So it is important to consider that depending on what phase you're in as well. So
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, and people often get a bit scared because they're maybe in a deficit and like, oh, I need to do even more to retain my muscle when I'm in a deficit. But I think a reminder for people, especially for lower grade deficits, like maybe a bodybuilding comp rep when you're below sort of physiological levels of optimality for a body fat standpoint, but just general deficits where you're still in a healthy body fat range, we got to remember that the stimulus required for maintaining muscle is lower than what is required for building it in terms of maybe total volume. Still would need to train, of course, with high intensity, and everything else remains the same. And the way I often look at it is stimulus instead of volume, because you can generate still a very, very high quality stimulus without sort of the same amount of volume per se. But yeah, I think any sort of additional points for training in your experience, Talia?
Yeah, so I guess I think what you said, Jack, as well really resonated with, there's a little bit of a spectrum there where some people are on one end where they're training all the time and they're probably not focusing enough on those other things like sleep. So we might be better off even reducing their training load to make room for more of those other recovery factors. But there's also this other end of the spectrum where people are maybe actually not training a whole lot and they could do more and they could have more volume and they could lift heavier and they could have better form. So it's kind of finding, I think, where people are on that spectrum and working with that. I think if someone wasn't recovering well, there's a few signs that I know I would look out for, and I'm sure you would too. So, are they having a strength or a power drop? Like have things been trending down, and for how long? Is there a plateau, or have they regressed? How's their motivation? How are they feeling? Of course too. Do they have less speed or less power or less explosiveness, depending on what type of training that they're doing, which is, of course, something even more relevant for other athletes. And, what's the perceived effort? Is the weight they were lifting a week ago much harder now or a few weeks ago? Like what's the timeline for that changing? And do they need more rest between sets, for example? So I think there's lots of different signs that we can monitor to really assess where on that spectrum someone might sit. And that's part of what a good coach does. So yeah, I think training wise, that does really matter too.
Yeah. I think you touched on some points there, which sort of bring up the concept of a deload as well. And I think deloading is an interesting one because like deloads, tapers, while they're quite well documented in other sports, especially sort of tapering for competition, we don't really have the same sort of research or literature around sort of lifting weights specifically. And that's, of course, what everyone on this podcast does, and the majority of people listening. So it does mean that the concept of a deload is a bit more of a gray area. And it's honestly something for myself that's changed a little bit over time professionally, but even personally from how I deload too. And I think it's worth touching on like at least some of my general thoughts as because it of course plays into recovery and how someone does recover across months. But for those that don't know, like a deload is essentially some sort of pullback in volume or intensity or frequency, or could even be as simple as increasing the number of rest days in the week. Some people like to do it super objectively and decrease by percentage amounts or by strict set amounts. And I'm sort of a middle ground. Like I very much match it to the client, where some clients love to still head into the gym for all the sessions and decrease the intensity by a very, very precise amount and do that mathematically. Whereas others, like even myself, like I'll just throw in an extra rest day or two and really just base it off how busy I am, like whether I actually feel motivated to go into the gym, because that's another symptom of needing a deload as well, is like how motivated do you feel to train? Like I think if your motivation to train is low and it's time for a deload, then like I think that's another big psychological benefit is to distance yourself from the gym a little bit for that week. So that way you're ready, you're very ready psychologically to get back in there when the new training week rolls around. So, and I think the other concept with deloading is, there's some people like to auto-regulate it. Some people like to do it every fixed amount of weeks. And I think just knowing yourself is important there. Like if you're someone who is inclined to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and not give yourself a deload, and you find out only when you get injured, then you should probably put yourself on a bit of a timeline and maybe deload every 8th week or every 9th week or whatever it may be. But if you're someone who like maybe occasionally misses the odd session, or like potentially if you have a lower training frequency as well, like you train 3 or 4 days a week rather than 5 or 6, like you could probably auto-regulate because you may not need the same sort of frequency of deloading. Anything you'd add there from a deload standpoint, Lauren?
Not really. I think you covered everything pretty well. I don't deload that often. I think I mentioned this before on the podcast. I might inadvertently deload if I have my period or something. And I'm like obviously that's once a month, but sometimes it might hit me even harder, and I might default just be doing less volume because I'm in so much pain. So for me, that's my like little integrated deload. But yeah, it really depends on the person. Like, someone who probably doesn't sleep that well might need, more of those intentional, strategies more often. But I think if you're ticking everything off, then really just it's about listening to your body. And if you're starting to get little niggles, of course it can also be like exercise execution and intensity, proximity, failure, etc. But I think another relative point is, and I've experienced this with a couple of clients, is that when they do a lot of different types of training and it crosses over, I often find that they need to intervene a little bit more proactively or do some more proactive recovery management. Like I've got someone who cycles and does a lot of endurance work, but then she's wanting to improve her, or she's wanting to improve her strength and build muscle too. So there's a bit of an overlap there. And I think she's just recently had some issues with her lower back, etc. So I think when you are an athlete, I think if you're training a lot, I think it's really good to at least have a very reliable physio that you see every 4 to 6 to 8 weeks or something, just for a bit of upkeep, because she's just recently been experiencing some issues just in relation to tight hip flexors and etc. from doing a lot of cycling, but then she's doing a lot of heavy squats as well. So she'd actually hadn't seen a physio before really ever. So she kind of felt it was a little bit of a setback, or that she was really disappointed, or it was a bit of failure on her part. But I'm like, it's not, because if anything, we've just identified, a couple of limitations and things that you just need to proactively work on so you can perform better in the long run. So a bit of cognitive reframing there really helped her. So now we're, proactively incorporating, particularly, specific mobility drills, or she might need to get some dry needling, or just different ways that she could think about, executing movements while she recovers. And she's just finding that extremely valuable, and that will help with the longevity of your training. So yeah, if you're smashing yourself all the time for doing a lot of weight training, particularly as you get a lot older, like I just don't feel like I don't recover as better as I used to when I was a lot longer. You do have to be very assertive and be a bit more proactive with whether you might need to see a physio just to get a bit of upkeep, and make sure that there are really specific tight muscles that might be making, some movement patterns hindered a little bit. It's important to be proactive and, sometimes get the ball in there, or go and get some dry needling every month or so.
Yeah, I think that's a key differentiator as well between like just general recovery and something that's quite specific around, because I think if someone does train hard enough for long enough, like something extraneous is going to pop up, which just your standard 8 hours of sleep a night and managing training volume isn't going to maybe sort out in the short term. It will need something that a specialist needs to address. So while we are dietitians, and while we also have accreditate or credentials for training programming, like we are not physios. So that's where additional expertise certainly comes in. So I think, we're already quite a decent amount of minutes into the episode, and like it was the intention with today to sort of mainly talk about training, just because I think that is the major lever that is underutilized or underrepresented when people talk about recovery. But we are going to talk about sort of some of these other tiers, which are, dare I say it, maybe a little bit more self-explanatory in terms of sort of implementation. And we have some sort of dedicated episodes to these ones, like around sleep, energy availability, fueling, but we're going to talk about them in the context of recovery. So we'll sort of lump these two tiers together around like sleep, adequate protein, and energy availability as well. But I guess from a broad perspective, making sure that you are sleeping enough, surprise, surprise, and also you are fueling enough as well. We did a recent episode on fueling, very in depth around how much people should be fueling and what some symptoms are that outside of just recovery and training performance that you need to be clued in from a fueling standpoint, especially if your training load is quite high. And then some aspects around protein intake as well. So on those topics, Talia, would you have any insights from yourself?
Where do I start? I guess as well, and what I'm about to say might just feed into this a little bit too, but it is so individual. And I think it was really interesting what you said as well, Lauren, around training around the menstrual cycle. And of course, there's a lot of mixed, I guess, research and a lot of beliefs that people have, because unfortunately there's a lot of misinformation out there. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things that is so variable from person to person. And whether, during certain times of the month, of course, for females, like you might not be sleeping well, you might be uncomfortable, you might feel nauseous, you might feel sick, even though, it's not a hard and fast rule for everyone. Like there might be situations in which you're not going to recover quite as well. And we need to take that into account. So I guess, as more broadly, when we have a look at sleep, I can say in practice, there's so many people that I see who just aren't sleeping enough, and they're training so hard. They're doing really well with their nutrition, but it's actually the missing piece that we need to work on. So it's really, really underrated. And, of course we have trainers, we have dietitians, we have physios, but we don't really have very often a sleep coach or anything like that. So it's, I guess, another hat that sometimes we need to wear and look at strategies around. And there are several things that we can do, whether, it's having a look at someone's bedtime routine, whether it's restructuring their day, whether it's, incorporating some unwinding techniques or having a look at stress. I think stress is another really big one as well that often gets missed. Like often with my clients, like if someone tells me or comes to me and says that they want to lose weight, I guess one of the first things that I'm really keen to know as well is, what does life look like for you right now? Like, do the next 10 weeks look crazy with work, or do you think you're going to be able to handle a cut in energy and potentially, cardio and whatever needs to be done? Because it's also okay if right now might not be the best time for that thing. And I'm not saying that it can't be done, but we can potentially just have a look at those stages and see, actually, is there going to be a time where this is going to be much easier for you? Because undersleeping, overstressing, work stress, life stress, it really does feed into those other recovery factors as well. Of course, with nutrition, like if you're stressed, you're not sleeping, then it's going to make it harder to adhere. And you're probably going to be craving more energy dense foods. And, especially when the food noise might start to get louder, particularly with people who might be in a contest prep, that becomes a lot harder to deal with if we don't have those other, recovery factors in place too. So I think those are probably what I would consider the big three, aside from training load. And then, of course, we've got the overall energy availability as well, like is something that there just seems to be exploding in terms of literature at the moment now. And once again, something that we do really need to look at, like in terms of nutrition, the biggest moving piece, I would say. And then from there, protein intake, total protein intake matters the most. But of course, distributing feedings throughout the day, if someone can handle that, then that's the next missing piece that we would look at and go from there.
Yeah, no, that's very comprehensive. I have some little sort of niche pieces, but I'll let you sort of touch on any points first, Lauren, around any sort of aspects of stress too, if you have any additional stuff.
Yeah, firstly, I definitely agree with you, Tala. Yeah, 100%. Sleep is so fundamental. I think the practical point is that somebody sleeping 5 or 6 hours per night is unlikely to compensate for that by using a massage gun for 10 minutes. Sleep is not just another recovery modality. It is part of the biological environment in which adaptation occurs. It is so extremely important, but again, easier said than done. So yeah, sometimes we do have to wear that sleep coach hat 100%. So, but yeah, in relation to stress, again, it's also one of those things that we've touched on previously in podcasts many times, various strategies to help with stress. Again, easier said than done. So yeah, I think that stress is that one where it can affect your sleep, and then your lack of sleep can then feed into other things. So it's kind of interlinked in a way as well. So yeah, I think it's just really important, particularly before you undergo a fat loss phase, as Talia said, if right now isn't the time to diet, that's okay, because you need to consider the potential compounding nature of your lack of recovery when your work is really hectic and stress is really hectic, sleep is really hectic, you're of low energy availability. That can also, at some point along the journey, affect your sleep if your sleep's already poor and you're already very stressed. So it is very, very important to just be aware of the environment create the journey that you're about to undertake, and whether your environment is set up or conducive to support that. So again, having a coach that understands all of these different elements, all of these different potential compounding factors is really, really important, because sometimes it might be a case of trying to work on these fundamentals before, trying to, as best as we can, get them under control before that we then suggest, okay, now is the right time to then undergo a deficit. So yeah, very important to consider.
Yeah, it's about picking your battles for sure, and giving yourself the best chance of being successful in that metaphorical battle. Because I think there's certainly many a occasion where someone does come to me and they're very enthusiastic about going down a certain path, and I can I don't ever want to say 100%, but maybe 60 to 80%. Okay, there's a 60 to 80% chance that it's going to be a bit of a struggle, or you may not reach that sort of end goal that you have in the short term because of these other things that need to be addressed first, and whether they're recovery related or stress related, sleep related, etc. But I did want to talk about some other points which are tangentially related to energy availability, protein, stress as well. One of them is sort of around blood work and micronutrients, which I think is more of a supporting cast for nutrition, because in the acute term, energy availability and protein is definitely more important. But over time, more chronically, micronutrient deficiency will, of course, compromise recovery for sure. Even something as simple as carbohydrate for glycogen replenishment, if someone is just tracking calories and maybe not having as many carbohydrates as there could be. Maybe they're even over prioritizing protein or over prioritizing dietary fat. Then their glycogenesis or glycogen replenishment won't be as good. Even for lifters where we don't rely on glycogen as much, like I still think it's a variable to mention. So regards to like micronutrients, I would say like the top ones would be iron, vitamin D, potentially magnesium as well, but particularly iron for females. Vitamin D is a super common one with, the majority of people being in a relatively compromised state for even in countries like Australia and with decent sunlight, people still aren't having enough vitamin D. So an easy thing to do is get a blood test, particularly if you're in Australia, but even overseas, like if your insurance covers that, or if you're in a country where you get free blood tests as part of your healthcare scheme, then it's a good opportunity just to see where you are and address that through diet or supplementation. So I totally agree with everything that you both mentioned around stress too. So I do want to touch a little bit on some of the things that are over prioritized in the media and on Instagram as well. Maybe we can each sort of touch on our favorites for that. I think I'll start off with maybe the slightly more cliche one, which is ice baths and cold therapy. And the ironic thing is, I truly think heat therapy like saunas is better than cold therapy for recovery. But I do think saunas is maybe more beneficial, like outside of the recovery realm, like maybe more so for things like cardiovascular health and maybe even brain health. I do think maybe there are some subtle recovery benefits, but I don't think spending half an hour in the sauna each day is moving the needle considerably compared to the other things that we've talked about. And then from a cold immersion standpoint, I do think cold immersion is great for anti-inflammatory benefits, but do those anti-inflammatory benefits correlate to improved recovery? Probably not. If anything, they are maybe blunting adaptation, like the positive adaptation that we want to experience after the gym. So like if you are doing cold water immersion or cold therapy, then you probably want to do that away from the workout, like maybe on your rest day or something, or as far away from your resistance training session or exercise session as you can manage. And I'm definitely not saying cold therapy is bad. Like it's my hat off to anyone who does cold therapy, because I tried it once and like I would say I'm reasonably tough for most things, but I couldn't handle the cold therapy. I think I dipped my foot in the cold water pool and like I quickly got out of there and went back to the hot pool. So yeah, similar experience.
Not.
Yeah. But what about you, Lauren? What are some things that you'd mention?
Yeah, I want to touch on the ice baths again quickly. My partner's brother invested in one at a work office, and I've got a video of my partner getting in it. And yeah, he was not fun. I think the question isn't necessarily like, did ice bath work? I think the better question is like, what outcomes are we trying to improve? What are we prioritizing? Tomorrow's performance or more of a long-term adaptation type thing. I think, and you briefly touched on this before in relation to hypertrophy and muscle. I think the inflammatory and anabolic responses following training are not necessarily problems that always need to be eliminated either. Like they are part of the signaling process that contributes to adaptation. And I think there was a 2024 review and meta-analysis, I think, that found that regularly using cold water immersion immediately after resistance training may attenuate hypertrophic adaptations, which is probably what you were referring to. So I think the evidence base remains relatively small, but the overall signal basically suggests that habitual post-lifting cold exposure may be less desirable when maximizing muscle growth, if muscle growth is the priority. So I think earlier mechanistic and longitudinal research also found that post-exercise cold water immersion may reduce anabolic signaling and muscle fiber growth, even when strength development is not necessarily impaired in the same context. So I think this may help an athlete feel better and perform again a little bit sooner from what I've seen. I don't know, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they should automatically be using it after every session. I think they might be more useful when like there's short-term performance things, or like the athlete has more of a congested schedule, or their soreness is likely to compromise an event the next day or something, but definitely proportionally less appropriate when hypertrophy is the main goal. The athlete already has adequate recovery time and they are using cold immersion immediately after every session. Like I probably wouldn't really suggest that. The other thing that I was going to say is the massage guns, because I remember when they came out, very, very, very popular. I think I bought one. I think they can.
I've got two.
Do you have them?
Well, I've got two, but I've maybe used them twice. So yeah,
Yeah,
one
okay.
each.
Well, you may or may not agree with me, but let's see. I think that they can be useful, but they're definitely not like a major recovery tool. I think they're a little bit overhyped. I think their clearest benefit is definitely, I think, short-term improvement, maybe in like range of motion or flexibility, or maybe temporary reduction in the feeling of tightness or pain. But I think for DOMS, delayed onset muscle recovery, actual recovery itself, I feel like the evidence is a little bit mixed. I think that some studies show modest improvements in soreness, while others find, I think, little to no benefit for strength recovery or swelling or endurance or muscle function or something of that nature. I think that one trial found that soreness could briefly actually feel worse for some people, maybe if they're going a little bit too hard. Also, I think that some people think that they break up knots really effectively from like removing lactic acid or flushing toxins, I've heard people say, or repairing muscle damage a lot faster.
Realigning muscle fibers and stuff.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. But in my opinion, I think that they're probably best used more of a comfort or a mobility tool, or maybe useful more when training, when the muscle feels quite stiff, or after training if the sensation feels nice and you like that. I think a lacrosse ball or a foam roller can maybe achieve a bit of a similar practical outcome, but I think the massage gun is simply quicker. Maybe it's easier to move around. I don't always love, rolling around on the floor. Requires a little bit less effort. So anyway, I think it's okay, but I think it was a little bit overhyped when it came out, in my opinion.
No, I'd agree with. Yeah, I'm definitely not in the camp of massage guns. Like I think the biggest benefit is maybe placebo and psychosomatic, rather than you're not realigning muscle fibers or breaking up knots. I think it's a nice. I mean, I know some people keep them in the gym bag, and it's almost the same as like I jump onto a lacrosse ball for 30 seconds before my leg day. Do I really think that's warming me up or like doing anything major from a readiness standpoint or recovery? 100% not. But it is a psychosomatic element that it's ingrained in me now. Like I do it and it's like, oh, I'm ready to train. Kind of like hopping on the foam roller for 30 seconds before a session. It's unlikely to really do too much. So what about you, Talia, in terms of some of your niche things on social media?
I guess just coming off the back of what you both mentioned there though as well, like I guess when we have a look at recovery, there's kind of two aspects as well. There's of course the physical side, and then there's also the mental side of things. And I think placebo as well can be really underrated. Like, of course, some of these things like massages and cold plunges, maybe it's not always, I guess, or the evidence might not be there to the standard of recommending it, but sometimes it can just make someone feel better. And I think as a coach, that's not always something that I rule out either, because I think that can be really important, especially if it's something that might relax them, like getting a massage or going to see the physio just to get a checkup, which of course is really valuable, especially in specific situations. But yeah, there's a few little things like that I think are also underrated because they just have that effect of making someone feel more recovered. I guess in terms of what's on social media at the moment, this one's a little bit controversial, but one thing that I am seeing a lot at the moment is just people unnecessarily supplement or taking electrolytes. So of course they do have a place. Like, if you're doing really intense exercise, you're sweating a lot, of course you've been unwell, vomiting, diarrhea, and so on. But a lot of the time, the people who I see in practice taking them probably don't need them, and they're just spending more money on expensive pee. Because at the end of the day, like, of course, sodium is going to be the main electrolyte there that we need to replenish post-exercise, but you're probably going to be getting that through food. Like, most people aren't having, aren't underdoing sodium. Sodium. Like, and the same goes. So I think that's one that just a lot of companies at the moment are profiting off and really selling misinformation towards, saying that everyone needs electrolytes when that's just not true. We don't have the evidence for that.
No, I agree with that. I know you've done reels on that too, Lauren.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we're all in the same camp there. I think, I would say 100% about the sodium. Like I think people can supplement with magnesium and potassium separately. I think if people eat enough fruits and vegetables, it's so easy to get enough potassium. Magnesium's a different story, but then again, in like an electrolyte supplement, it's quite rare for the magnesium to be dosed in a efficacious amount. Like it's usually sub 100 milligrams, which is neither here nor there from a magnesium standpoint. So you're better off just supplementing directly with a magnesium glycinate or threonate. So yeah, I do think we could go on forever about some of these social media recovery things. And I think there's so many supplements in general which are targeted towards recovery, which again, I don't think they move the needle too much. Like there are some niche ones, like for example, L-theanine, which I think in certain situations can help with stress management and stress regulation. But again, in the context of overall stress management, it's minute. Like I think it's again quite circumstantial, where maybe if someone is managing their stress well, but they're just in an acutely stressful period, then something like that could be helpful. But as long as they're managing everything alongside that. But is there any sort of final points you wanted to mention, Lauren?
Yeah. So I think to round out the podcast, I would encourage the listener to think before selecting a recovery modality, I would ask 4 questions. So like, I would be thinking, what did the athlete do? Was it like a long endurance event? Was it a hypertrophy session? Was it a tournament? Was it a really technical session? Was it an exercise with extreme heat? Whatever. Different training creates different recovery demands inevitably. And then the second thing is what outcome specifically matters. Are we trying to restore strength, sprint performance, like glycogen, like hydration, range of motion, psychological readiness or whatever? And then I would think, thirdly, when do they need to perform again? An athlete competing again in 6 hours may need a different recovery strategy from someone who, has another 2 days of rest, say. And then the last thing is like, what is the long-term goal? Inevitably, like if the priority is hypertrophy or, habitual immediate cold water immersion may be less appropriate for them. If the priority is performing again tomorrow, are you, another athlete who needs to, perform quite often, maybe reducing soreness and inflammation may be worthwhile. Insert, X recovery modality there. So it's, really important before you go and jump on all these, before you, engage in any of these fads or anything, think about like, what's the science behind it? What is it actually being proven to be useful for? And just make sure that you hit all of the actual things that move the needle, the rocks most, which is what we briefly touched on, which is overall energy availability and stress and sleep, etc. And then you can sprinkle in the other, potential modalities at the end, depending on the questions that I just,
For sure. Yeah, I think a lot of it is cultural too, where in the case of electrolytes, I can see the appeal. Like you feel like you're a pro athlete waking up, having electrolytes in the morning. It's a bit of a ritual and routine, which I think if those things can be helpful, I guess, to play devil's advocate, maybe if they do help with your identity of being someone who does engage in recovery protocols. But again, if it's just that and nothing else, it's not, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. So
if it helps you get your water intake up, I'm all for it. If it tastes like nice solid water and it helps you, get your fluids in, you don't mind paying for it, expensive pig, as you might have said, I think go for it.
Yeah. And that's something we didn't actually mention explicitly, is hydration, which is, of course, is super important too. But I almost forgot, to be fair, but we'll finally end with something that we learned this week. So I'll throw this over to you first, Lauren.
Mosquitoes. Do you guys get bitten a lot? Or they don't really touch you?
Yes.
No, I get bitten a lot. Yeah. I mean, I live in a wetland, so there's plenty of mosquitoes.
Okay. I get bitten a lot. My partner never gets touched. And do you guys know why that might be, or have any type of idea? I heard it was because you eat a lot of bananas. I heard that once. And then I heard something else about your blood type. Do you guys know why some people get more bitten than others?
Presumed I taste good.
Well, pretty much. But I read the other day that scientists think they may have figured out why people are more mosquito magnets than others. And once I tell you the answer, you might be like, oh, but it turns out it's, probably not your blood type. I think the biggest factor appears to be the unique mix of actual chemicals that your skin naturally produces, particularly compounds called carboxylic acids or something like that are found in your skin oils. So, naturally, some people might consistently produce a lot more high amounts of these chemicals, making them way more attractive to spaghetti, way more attractive to mosquitoes than others. So, we just have particular, more amounts compounds of carboxylic acids, or however you pronounce it. So very interesting.
Makes sense. I think I read something, I don't know if this is true, but around blood sugar as well, like people who maybe have slightly higher blood sugar potentially attract more mosquitoes. But sweeter blood, I don't know. But what about you, Talia?
I think one thing that I guess kind of learnt and realized a little bit this week is sometimes how like you can be in the same environment or something, but just have a little bit of a shift in perspective. And that can actually influence so much you perceive the things around you and how you think and how you feel. So I guess not really a fun fact, but just a little bit more of a reminder that that does play a really big role in how you see and perceive and operate with the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I often find that because I don't deviate from my routine very often. Like sometimes when I do go away and have a change in scenery and then come back, like it's a different outlook on your kind of like when you go for a holiday, and then the best outcome for a holiday I find is when you come back and like you actually want to get back into routine versus like experiencing post holiday blues. But yeah, I like that. In terms of myself, like I was just doing some research on. I've always heard of partially hydrolyzed guar gum as a fiber supplement, but I never really did too much looking into like why it may be a preferential supplement compared to something like psyllium husk. And psyllium husk is sort of the main ingredient used in products like Metamucil, whereas partially hydrolyzed guar gum is usually more of a standalone fiber supplement and has an interesting name, which I think sometimes puts people off because it sounds quite processed, which I guess to an extent it is, but it's basically like more of a prebiotic fiber, which also is more FODMAP friendly. So like if some people do have psyllium husk and it does maybe upset their bowels, or if they have IBS, it triggers anything, then a partially hydrolyzed guar gum can be better. And it's more so for digestion comfortability and regularity, whereas I would describe psyllium husk as maybe more of like a constipation aid due to its soluble fiber nature, and also just having some benefits for sort of cholesterol management potentially as well. But obviously both supplements for a reason. And like the other thing to bear in mind is that they're just one fiber type each. So like ideally you don't want to be relying on really either of those as your primary fiber source, because it's going to be beneficial to have different types of fiber. But yeah, I think that does it for this episode. Thanks everyone for tuning in again, and we'll be back next week.